Hello, and welcome to the Quali webinar on Microsoft Azure, not just another pie in the sky. I'm Das Dosanjh, Director of Technical Marketing, and I'm glad that you could join us today. A little background on Quali before we begin. We provide environments as a service. These essentially are for the IT department to automate and orchestrate the software components as they go and update their infrastructure on the network and as well as the application side of the house. So any digital transformation or initiatives that you're undertaking could be well suited for these environments as a service. We are a private company with investors both here in the United States and in Israel, and we have a large volume of customers in both the enterprise and service provider space in a lot of telcos, cloud providers, banks, and credit card companies. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Azure itself. Azure is from Microsoft, and they started out with a public cloud offering, and they've really accelerated and expanded their global footprint with 54, I should say, regions worldwide and 140 countries where they are now available. This is key when you start to look at the geo distribution of their data centers and where these compute and database services are available. Important because regulations are driving a lot of where the data has to be stored, and then obviously with users wanting that localized transaction for performance, they want to make sure that they're not going all across the world to receive certain services when the performance can be optimized in their local geolocations. So a very broad range of locations where they can actually be providing these services from. So as I mentioned, they started out with the public cloud, which is predominantly their primary offering. But what they also announced last year was a hybrid cloud offering. So you have the Azure services in the public cloud, but now you also have the Azure stack in your private or on-premise data center. This provides a unified development environment and orchestration for the DevOps teams. So whatever you create on-prem can now be deployed into the public cloud when it passes certain criteria. As you go down this hybrid cloud offering, you can also then take your management and security components and postures that are on-premise and then make sure that those are being adhered to as you now move into the public cloud within the Azure environments. And as you go into tying that into Active Directory and that federated identification and roles-based permissions can also be then applied not only to the on-prem persona, but then to the public cloud persona also. And last but not least, as you get into the data itself, key here is data consistency. So a lot of the data migration or the data transference, if you will, from one database schema to another can happen seamlessly as you start to do that mapping from the on-prem and the Azure stack to the services that are offered in the public cloud. So this is very exciting because obviously this takes away a lot of the pain points that you see in how do you take on-premise environments, how do you take a subset of the on-premise environments and move them into a public cloud. It can be very seamlessly done here with the Azure public cloud and then the Azure stack. So let's paint a picture here, or I should say, let's cook something up. So the statement that I've put here is the road to cloud. It's not easily cooked up. And what I mean by that is, use the analogy of a kitchen environment. You've got to prep things. You've got to then obviously cook the ingredients and that you have ready for the meal. And then you have to clean up afterwards. And what may happen oftentimes is you have stale ingredients, you may have the wrong tools, you may not have even a right workflow of how you put things in order in a kitchen. And what's depicted here in this illustration is you got too many cooks in the kitchen, and then you may undercook or overcook the meal, and eventually that leads to a bad taste in the mouth. So why am I bringing a kitchen analogy with this particular idea? Is because in the cloud environment, it follows a similar construct. You may have public, private, hybrid, multi-cloud, and you've got to figure out how to model, deploy, and automate not just your infrastructure components, but your application components and various dependent data sets that need to work with those applications and obviously then right on top of the infrastructure. And similar to the cooking analogy here, you may have non-collaborative teams. They are may do well by themselves, but they're not collaborating. You may have a lot of security requirements and regulations that you have to adhere to, but they have a huge impact on performance or end user experience. So there might be a misalignment or a mismatch there. And that's really similar to the kitchen scenario where you got a bad taste in the mouth. On the cloud side, you got bad user experience. So is it really worth all the investment and effort that you try to do to put something in the cloud when it's really turning out bad? So let's take that a step further. Understanding your baseline objectives. What are you really trying to do? We put this into the functionality, security, and performance in the Azure cloud. And using that pie analogy, you want delicious new pies. You want customer satisfaction based upon the new variety and where you can serve these pies. And now you can maintain a consistent experience. In the cloud side, you want to offer value-added new services because you're introducing new customer values with emerging technologies and digital disruption. But you also want to localize those services based upon regulations, that geographic reach based upon the diversity of those locations. Then you want that consistent experience. So whether they're in Asia Pac, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, or the North America, that consistent experience is delivered throughout. So that's the baseline objective and how to make sure that the functionality, security, and performance, and how can Azure address that? So let's take a look at some of the risks involved. You really, as I mentioned before, with too many cooks in the kitchen that aren't collaborating, you need to have the DevOps, SecOps, and IOps, or the IT department, really collaborate around the workflow and the workloads. And what I mean by that is, if they're working together, or if they're putting the integration components together in the enterprise data center, you also want them to collaborate as they move certain workloads and workflows into the Azure cloud. So if you're doing a lift and shift versus a replatforming, or if you're doing something net new in the cloud, you want to make sure that these teams are aligned, and so they're not doing repetitive work or things are getting delayed, and you're really introducing more risk every time there's a misalignment. So let's take a look at how Quali then brings that alignment together. So if you're in the developers creating code and checking it into Git, you're the QA department and you may have your own Python scripts that you may want to use. Your IT operations where you're facilitating servers, or you're the DevOps team where you're now bringing in your tools to automate some of the orchestration. So what CloudShell provides is a self-service portal into these environments where you can now make your blueprints and then create your sandboxes. So you can have one for developers, one for IT, and one for the DevOps teams. They may have different tools and products that they may want to introduce into these environments. You orchestrate that and then publish it into an environment. And this environment could be in the public cloud with Azure, as I've identified here, or it could be on the on-premise private data center using the Azure Stack or components of it. Once it's deployed and traffic is starting to move through, you can now have visibility into that by using intelligence for analytics and seeing how the security posture is or how the performance is taking shape in those environments. So putting it together, here's a scenario on how to migrate a traditional on-premises data center app to Azure. So here's that three-tier architecture. We have the front-end user interface. We have, it could be a web server sitting on Apache. You have the application logic itself on a second server, and then you have a database. And then around it, you may have various orchestration applications, whether they're in-house or third-party, something that a person may have developed on their own to manage, provision, configure, and then ultimately monitor what's going on. And then you may have additional tools from different departments. So let's say the security team is looking at vulnerability scans or the open source in some of the code. And then the performance team is looking at load and performance. How does the application perform under scale when large traffic patterns are being introduced? So you have all of this environment that has to work together. And then as you go into the Azure Cloud, and that top application environment virtual network, we have the API gateway, a couple of logic components that make up the order management and payment service in this case, and then a database for the data store itself. We're going to orchestrate this using CloudShell. And then we have a couple of partners that we're introducing from both a visibility and security standpoint. Cavrin from security and compliance visibility, and then a CDN from visibility into performance. So let's go ahead and conduct the demo. So within CloudShell, I bring up the user interface and I'll go ahead and enter my credentials. And the very first screen that pops up is the blueprints. So in here I can have some predefined blueprints, or I can go ahead and create a new one. If I go ahead and create a blueprint, it gives me an option to pick from previous templates or other designs. I've got a blank canvas right now, so I'm going to go ahead and select App Service, and here I'll have a catalog of choices, so from networking components, applications, so on and so forth. If I wanted to add certain components, all I'd have to do is just drag the component onto the canvas, and it would then auto-populate the canvas with whatever pieces of, or I should say components of the application in this case, are added to the canvas. And so this is a simple drag and drop. I can actually do some more customizations to this blueprint if I want by going to Blueprint Properties. And that then invokes another window that allows me to set timestamp durations, different startup and teardown scripts that could be associated with this particular blueprint, as well as different levels of code or build numbers that I wanted associated with this. So what I have already done is set up a blueprint with these different components available in orders payments, and I've got a sandbox up and running. So the sandbox already has these various components active, and let's go ahead and navigate to that sandbox. And here are, I should say, the 4 nodes that I've got deployed. If I look at the activity and the output windows, you'll see that there were various stages where things were being set up, things were being administered, instantiated, and then finally configured. In an active sandbox, I can actually then look at to see if the application is reachable. And here's an example of a Node.js application. The web interface is actually functional. And from the node itself, I can navigate right into the command line. So if I wanted to see or just change something on the node itself, I now have command line access. So that's a quick example of how you would add a particular component. You can mix and match these pieces. You can see that things are online and active, and then these are deployed in the Azure public cloud. If I navigate to the Azure public cloud and I look at the name API Gateway, Order Management, Payment Service, Data Store, and here's my VM environment within Azure Cloud, my virtual machines, here's my API Gateway, Data Store, Order, and Payment Services. So that's a quick snapshot into how this blueprint is deployed. If I wanted to change anything on the blueprint, I can go back into the blueprint itself. And let's say I wanted to introduce a security component, and I want to add a security scoring tool, in this case by Cavrin. And Cavrin does a security posture assessment. So what I would do here is align it to that particular API gateway, hover over my connection, and then connect it to the API gateway. So that creates a network connection between an external tool and then the application itself. If I wanted to add a visibility tool, I can also now come back into my Loader Performance tab and add an Exedian PVX. So that will provide me visibility into the traffic. But I want to connect the traffic to a load balancer. So in this case, I'm going to actually introduce a network component and have an Azure load balancer. So this will now load balance between the API gateway and other tools that I bring into the canvas. So go ahead and collect the Azure Load Balancer to my API gateway, as well as to my CDN PBX. So that is the network component. And the application has, since it's on a local LAN segment, it has the next hop already identified. But this gives you an idea of how I can quickly introduce the security and visibility tools. And the last but not least, I'll introduce a load of performance capability with BlazeMeter. And BlazeMeter now will generate traffic into this environment, and that will let me know how the application is performing when the security tools are implemented. And in this case, now this blueprint is now ready to deploy. So if I hit reserve, it will prompt me for the different things that I need to enter as values. So that's another example of a blueprint that could be modified and add different components to validate security and performance. I also have different blueprints that show the Azure public cloud with the Azure stack. So here is an example of a blueprint that has the public cloud at the top with Kavrin, a CDN, and the Azure load balancer. And then on-premise, I have an Nginx load balancer with the CDN Azure stack and the Kavrin Azure stack. So that's an example how you can mix and match and then introduce different network components at a later time. Let's go back to our sandbox, which we have active here. And I'm going to go ahead and terminate the sandbox. So it's as simple as hitting this end sandbox for all. You hit OK. The process has started. And now, if I look at my output and commands, you'll start to see that teardown has started. And with that, the canvas is now empty and the apps are powered off and deleted. And as you'll note, that the connectivity is being cleaned up and that resources are being now relinquished from the Azure environment. If I go ahead and do a refresh, you'll notice now that the other servers are no longer present. So that is a simplified way of how you can create a blueprint, deploy a blueprint, and then mix and match different workloads as far as security, performance, and visibility, and then tear down a blueprint after an established time. So with that, some of the benefits are you can simplify your application rollout. The automation of this can really expedite how you deploy and how you tear down those environments. Obviously, with those environments not being left as orphans running there without any controls, you can control the cost and how you utilize those resources in the cloud. And then you can actually validate the different cybersecurity postures by bringing in various tools to determine if you're compliant. So hungry for more. So this is Azure, and we call it not just another pie in the sky. You can actually model, orchestrate, and deploy. And to find out more, you can go to our website and our resources and articles and videos and blogs on our website. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over for any Q&A. And just looking at some of the questions, one of the questions is, can you mix and match environments with Azure and let's say AWS? And the answer is yes. You can have workloads in Azure, whether it's a combination of the hybrid model that we showed in the public cloud and in the Azure stack. So if you are going to move workloads into a different environment for whatever reason, whether it's a business decision or an existing cloud service that you've subscribed to, you can actually integrate that into the CloudShell environments. And another question that is how do we then actually use it with other on-premise components or software tools? So we do support OpenStack and vCenter from VMware. So if you are, or if you do have your own Python script, if you have your own development work that you've created in-house, you can actually create what we call plugins or shells into our application. So if you've got a script that you want to incorporate, whether you're deploying it on-premise or even want to use modified scripts into the cloud, you can actually utilize the investment that you've made with internal tools, and then you can leverage them as required for the various components. I think we have time for one more question, and it's regarding infrastructure. Infrastructure can be modified, so if you wanted to modify a load balancer, as an example, we use the Azure load balancer, but if you have existing licenses or software registrations with different software components, HA proxy, Nginx, things of that nature, you can then mix and match infrastructure, what I call lift and reshape, if you will, from what you may have had on premise, as well as changing the application infrastructure. So you can collapse various components of a database and application and the front end, or you can keep them separated for microservices. So with that, get in touch. You can go to our website. You can find us on LinkedIn, and also follow us on Twitter. This is Dost Assange, and thank you very much for joining us on the webinar.